Yeah, hello, welcome. Now let's talk about what makes a build deal damage in Lostark. And for that to happen, you want to know one thing before you make any build, and that's identify how much gold are you willing to spend for how much damage. The reason for me saying that is that a lot of builds that exist in the game cannot perform well unless you reach a certain threshold. After reaching the certain threshold, you will deal a lot of damage. If that goes for the idea of having the specific tribus to make your build work, or having the right amount of stats, or a lot of different things. So that goes to the idea of, like, if you don't have that specific build complete, like the basis of the build complete, you won't deal the damage that the build can reach. So that all goes to the amount of gold you're gonna spend on a build. Now for any build, you want to understand one thing, is what are your damage sources. You want to identify the damage sources for your own build, and once you do that, you can now understand how to increase your damage and go to the next step, which is how to increase your damage. What is my next step? Now that's the most important thing when it comes to any build. Some builds will deal most of their damage from their identity, like for example shadow hunters, where if they play the transformation. If you play with like summoner build that plays around your identity, and these classes share one thing in common. They don't need a lot of tribots for them to specifically deal damage with their ability. They only need tribots to get that damage. Like, they need only things to make them reach that identity, fill the bar for them to deal damage. And that's the best part about that. That means they don't need a lot of gems to deal the damage. They can buy a 1 level 10 gem and deal a very high amount of damage compared to other builds. Like, if you compare, for example, one class builds, like for example, if you compare the summoner build, the one that goes around the summons, and the one that goes with the identity and deals more damage, the one with the summons deals a lot of the damage comes from 6 different abilities, which is 4 summons and 2 damaging abilities. Now the identity build, on the other hand, the most of your damage comes from your identity plus 2 most dealing high damaging abilities, and the rest of the abilities you have are gonna be buffs and ways to get that identity fast. So when it comes to that idea, for you to reach the ceiling of these builds, one build will need 6 damage gems, and the other hand, another build will need less than that. And that same thing goes for Shadow Hunter, which is the most important example of this whole idea, is that for anyone to play Shadow Hunter and reach the maximum damage of that build and that class, it's a lot easier than any other build. You need only 2 gems, you need less tribots than other build, and the character is a lot easier. So that's the whole idea of how to identify. That's why you notice something different in a lot of builds. You notice that you perform much better with some classes than others, and you feel like you deal a lot more damage. And the idea here is not that the classes are bad or the damage is slow. Yes, obviously classes are different than each other, builds are different, but there is one most important thing, is that how much damage that you deal from your build. Some of the classes deal high damage from one specific way, and once you get all of these, your build is complete. And that's the idea of, like, why I said that you want to know how to make your build complete. Like, what are the bases of your build? Like, some builds don't need a specific amount of spec. Like for example, if you play a war dancer build and you play around esoteric, which is your meter, and you need a specific amount of spec for you to have constant orbs. If you don't reach that number, which is I think around 800 or so, you won't have the normal patterns. Your patterns won't be good. Like, your rotations won't be clean enough for you to deal high damage. And that's the whole idea of identifying how to make your build complete and thinking of ahead. How much money are you willing to spend to reach the damage? Because the builds are different, and the amount of money you're going to spend on one build is different. And like for example, I'm talking for experience here, is my artillerist. There are 2 builds here that you can play, one with the firepower meter and one with the barrage. Now the firepower meter is cheaper than the barrage, but for the firepower meter to reach the capacity damage, you need tribots on all the abilities, you need damage on all the abilities. But then on the other hand, the barrage mode, you need only the tribots that get you the barrage mode fast, and then on that you want some of your damaging abilities to deal more damage, but most of your damage comes from your barrage, which you can just ignore some of your other damaging abilities and focus on the barrage, get it like a high gem. that makes you deal a lot more damage. So that's the whole idea of how much are you willing to spend. There's also another thing that is really important on how your build is gonna deal damage, and that's about how the game is designed, like how Lostark is designed. Now, when you think about any character, there's only three stats you can play, where there's like crit, pick, or swiftness, and you mix it all up. Now, when you do all of that, the way that you deal the damage comes into two ideas. Either you're gonna build a build where you're gonna deal burst damage, high damage, after setting up something, or you're gonna deal a consistent amount of damage. It's not as high, but it's consistent. Now that's the thing is here about that is I feel like spec classes and the classes that deal high burst of damage are kinda better in this game, because how the game is designed of that most of the bosses have a lot of periods where they break and they don't move, so it's a lot easy for you to deal damage. Plus your support will give you a huge buff most of the time at that time, because you know that the boss won't move and it will be a lot easier for you to deal damage. You're gonna maximize dealing damage with all of your abilities. That comes to the burst. Now on the other hand, the swiftness class, who's been dealing a lot of damage the whole time, like if the swiftness class is dealing 100 million damage on the period of a minute, and the spec class has been dealing only like 50 because they don't want to go with the burst, but then once the burst happen, the swiftness class, let's say, will deal 50 million in the burst, but the spec class will deal 200 or 150 or 300 million, because that's when they're gonna deal their biggest damaging ability, and you know they're gonna have the buffs. So that comes to the idea of the design of the game. But everything comes with a cost, and it all comes to your play style. For example, the spec classes and the classes that have mostly burst can miss their abilities a lot more, so they might not deal a lot of damage. And actually, you might notice that you might play with a Surk who plays Igniter, and that Surk will deal no damage, and another player who's playing the same build and will deal so much more damage. It all comes to the idea of how to play the character, and that all goes to you and the play style you wanna play. So the idea here is how to pick the best build for you is to identify two things. Identify how much you're gonna deal damage, your damaging source, and the idea of how much money you're gonna spend to deal the damage. And the second thing is identify the play style you're going to play. For a spec character or a big burst character, you know that you will need to use a long combo. Like a lot of characters will need to use 3-4 abilities to deal that damage, and while they're doing that, you don't want to be interrupted. If the boss is gonna move or the boss hits them, they might die because they're casting. But on the other hand, a swiftness character won't have to be stuck in that, so they're less risky to die. And I feel like in this game, spec characters deal kind of more damage, not all the time, but they kind of deal more damage, especially when it comes to easier content and raids that have been in the game for a while, then more swiftness. But swiftness character die kind of less, and they're better to play in newer raids. But that all comes to your own play style. And most important thing is that some builds are gonna be a lot more expensive than others, because the most expensive thing will be in this game is reaching the next step, which is the last, perfecting your build, the last bit of damage, getting the full level 10 gems or maximizing everything. That part is gonna be very expensive. So once you identify how much you're willing to pay for a build, not because a build is cheaper early on is it gonna be progressively cheaper on the whole build, or not because the build is gonna be expensive at the first, it's gonna be also expensive at the end. This is gonna be different from each other. So that's the whole idea. So yeah, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.